Okay, welcome everyone to today's webinar, Local Preschool Financing Strategies in Massachusetts. My name is Titus Dostromedius. I'm the Director of Research and Policy at Strategies for Children.
And hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's Amy O'Leary at Strategies for Children.
And we have a very exciting agenda today. Amy and I have wanted to convene community members around this preschool finance topic for a while now. So thank you for joining us. Briefly, I'm going to go over the agenda and the speakers that we have today on the webinar. So Amy and I are going to present a quick overview of preschool expansion in Massachusetts. And then we're going to hear from three communities who are leading the way, Holyoke, Springfield, and Boston. And we have folks from school district and community-based partners from each community ready to present and share what they have been doing in their communities to try and make preschool expansion a reality. And then we will have some question and answer time and pause at the end for next steps and closing. So very briefly, we just wanted to share some context before we jump into the community stories. So at Strategies for Children, we typically use this slide to highlight child enrollment for preschool age children. And as we all know, it's a mixed provider system. There are children in public schools, children in community-based settings. There are many children, the orange wedge there, who are not enrolled in any formal programming. So this slide is good for getting a quick sense of what access looks like statewide, but it's also a good slide for highlighting where what the funding streams are that actually fund the system. So blending and braiding of funding streams is definitely a strategy that communities are using, and we'll hear more about today. But I just wanted to highlight this and get you thinking about the different sources of funding. Of course, parent fees are the largest source, as we tend to say, with private paying making up roughly 43% of all children statewide. It varies from community to community, of course. One more thing to mention is the PEG wedge. So several of you on the call, and actually all three of our presenters, were grantees of the Preschool Expansion Grant Program, or PEG. That program has ended in August and is being sustained in part through the Commonwealth Preschool Partnership Initiative, or CPPI. Now, so I will be updating this slide soon, but while PEG was purely federal grant money, I just wanted to point out that the CPPI is more of a blended funding model using state and some local and other sources to implement. So this is a map of preschool expansion in Massachusetts, and in red, we've highlighted the 19 communities that either had PEG funding or have received a CPPI grant. There are 9 communities who have that at this time, or planning grant funds, which also came through the CPPI line item. So 19 communities with one of those scenarios or multiple grants. 29% of preschool age population in the state lives in these 19 places, and 14% concentrated in Boston, Worcester, and Springfield. So we just like to point that out and also acknowledge that these communities are experimenting and demonstrating what preschool expansion could look like. 3 of these communities are presenting today, and we're going to hear from them soon, and several others are listening. So we checked before the webinar, and 15 different Massachusetts communities are represented on the call today. So thank you again for your interest in this topic. And all right, that's all the time that I wanted to spend setting up the community stories. So now we're going to turn it over to Stephen Huntley and Stephen Zreich in Holyoke.
All right, thank you. We're privileged to be part of this, and thank you for inviting us to share our story. And it's easy because we're both Steve, so this will begin the Steve show about Holyoke. Want to just talk a little bit about the history. I'm Steve Zreich, the superintendent receiver of schools, and Steve Huntley, who is the director of the Valley Opportunity Council, and we're going to jointly be doing this presentation. So the work started. We wanted to go back to about 2014, and the status of preschool in the community as it pertained to the school system was we had about 220 or so students who were predominantly in one location in our district. They were mostly in half-day programs, special education programs with peers, and they were all at at the time the district had a pre-K center, and so very few of those 220 students were going to school full day, and so that's where we were in 2014 as a school district.
And there were partners around the school district doing miscellaneous work. 2014 was a year that the prior administration at Holyoke Public School piloted a program where the Holyoke Public School was essentially a landlord for 3 classrooms, 1 classroom in each elementary school, and at which point it was funded through EEC and private pay, the typical EEC-like scenario. Where there were some vouchers, there was some DCF involved children, there were some homeless children, but there was really no deliberate sharing of information or best practices. We were, for all intents and purposes, a tenant. Any sort of best practice that came of it was because our staff on the ground really tried to get to know the kindergarten teachers, et cetera, et cetera. It was really what led to our PEG, and we'll talk about that in the next slide, and how that was structured and laid out. And then, of course, you have to mention the Holyoke Chicopee Springfield Head Start, VOC, Square One, and dozens of home providers, and a few other smaller early ed providers doing some private pay. There was some Catholic school related parochial early education being involved, but it was very separate, distinct. The public school had their 220-ish kids. We had our kids. Head Start had their kids. Square One had their kids. So it was very, very parochial in a lot of ways.
So the next slide is, so in the world of PEG, after Preschool Expansion was implemented in Holyoke, with the grant, we were able to increase the number of seats by 80 by 80 students in over 4 elementary schools, and with partnerships with Valley Opportunity Council and Head Start. And the programs were located at the onset. All 4 of the classes were in our schools because we had space. And Steve will talk a little bit more about what the relationship and partnership look like here. But what PEG also did for us is it really stimulated a community-wide conversation about expansion and and building a stronger infrastructure for higher quality early ed programs throughout the city and within the school system. And there were a lot of demand for full day programs in the throughout the schools, and our school leaders began to express their interest in having their own pre-Ks or adding pre-K. So the schools that did not have a pre-K program wanted their own. They wanted full day programming. And so by the end of last year, which was the end of PEG, we had doubled the number of kids that were in pre-K that were was associated with the school system. And so now we're somewhere between 420 to 450 students who are in pre-K, many of which are in full day programs. And there has been a huge demand for dual language programming and pre-K programming because we have 2 dual language schools, which has a strand of classrooms, and parental demand was asking us to begin dual language in pre-K. And so we added, 2 years ago, we added 2 classrooms, and then last year, or the beginning of this year, we added 2 additional classrooms. So we have 4 full day dual language classrooms, which we were able to launch with funding that we were some of the additional funding that the state provided going into this upcoming school year. So PEG really helps stimulate this commitment and interest to around pre-K throughout the city.
The way PEG was required to be implemented really was great for the partners because it required an early education infrastructure that brought the public schools and the community partners together. That infrastructure has been very valuable. And honestly, if you were to ask me 5 years ago, I would have said, but the reality is we both have strengths we bring to the table. We both recognize we have strengths we bring to the table. And we're both trying to figure out how to work best within our strengths. So the communication was much stronger and deliberate. The measurements, the programmatic assessments, the children assessments, just the fact that we were getting children better ready for kindergarten with, in some cases, some minor tweaks to our curriculum and to our processes was really where the value came from. And we knew what kindergarten ready looked like because we were observing in kindergarten, because we had professional development with the kindergarten teachers. So we knew what the kindergarten teachers were learning for the first time. We understood and then the city did a great job of really sharing their trauma-informed training as well early on. It's a little bit of a trendy thing to talk about now, trauma-informed care. 4 or 5 years ago, when we started these conversations, Holyoke was on trauma-informed care in the classroom. And we were able to piggyback on that, and that has made a big difference in what in allowing our teachers to feel like they have the tools to handle or to work with kids in the right way. So in partnership, we worked really hard with them, and our quality improved to the point where we have almost all level 4, which is the top level, unlike it's the top level at EEC. So our centers are level 4 QRIS certified. And a lot of that, or some of that, is the hard work of our staff, but it's also opening our eyes to the public schools and kindergarten readiness, et cetera. And really, we've put a lot of investment in quality to make sure that when children come to our centers, they're leaving ready for kindergarten. So through the CPPI, we were awarded 60 children to replace the PEG 80 slots that are in 3 Holyoke Public School elementary schools. But we also have a Chapter 70 funded classroom at Morgan School that's operated by VOC. What's different is because we are able to expend Chapter 70 money through a subcontract with the public schools due to a RFP and a process we went through where they give us a portion of the operating cost of the classroom, and we do everything for it. We work in partnership with Enrollment, and that's maybe a tab we should have put here on the slide, Steve. How we work together to enroll children and figure out what the best slot for them is, or what the best option for that child is, whether it's dual language, whether it's a voucher, whether it's a Chapter 70 classroom. It's an important element of it too that maybe must be spoken about, is how we joint enroll kids.
Yeah, and so we're excited about this one classroom that we opened, which is really blending Chapter 70 dollars and EEC dollars, or funding that VOC has, so that we can so we have one classroom that VOC operates for the Holyoke Public Schools, and we're allowed that we're given that flexibility because as a district in receivership, there's a lot more flexibility in being able to contract services or contract the operation of different programs. We have an operator who runs a school, and we, in the case of VOC, we have an operator who's operating a classroom, and the students are Holyoke Public School students. We're just utilizing VOC's expertise, their connections to the community. And we'd like to continue to expand some of that work, because the bandwidth that requires for a public school system to provide the level of support and guidance and expertise in that in the pre-K space, is difficult for a district that has a lot of other needs at the same time. So we want to continue to work with VOC to expand access to full day, and we hope full year programming. One of the challenges we face is how to support the special education community. The students who need the full day programs the most are in our integrated classrooms, and the way that the PEG grant was written, and the way that the VOC programming is set up, it doesn't accommodate some of the students who have significant special needs, and we've got to figure out a way to have those students have a full day experience. To me, that's a significant inequity for our students who are the most vulnerable and most needy in our school system prior to coming to kindergarten.
And to add on that, when we talk about what the strengths the public school has that we just don't have the infrastructure for, it's absolutely appropriate care for the special ed children. And there's many, many of them that find their way because their parents work, because their parents need full day, full year care. And how can we expand to fill that need is what we're talking about now and trying to work through. So during PEG, past PEG, we still have 2 centers fully funded by EEC sources, homeless kids, private pay kids, contracts, vouchers, etc. And we continue to try to work to blend together Chapter 70 and EEC funding in the same classroom, where parents aren't charged a fee. They're eligible based on their address, much like DESE and Holyoke Public Schools requirements are, versus ours where we have to take their address. But more importantly, we need their income, we need the family size, we need all those other things. And we're trying to get a program that doesn't measure those things. And so can we blend together Chapter 70 and EEC and still meet the federal regulations that EEC has to fulfill? And the challenges without PEG going forward that we're working, we're actively really spending time looking at to make sure we don't let fall is the continued communication. PEG really required us to meet and communicate often. And with the CPPI is very different. We don't necessarily have the resources to meet as often with it. So we have to force that communication. We have to continue the professional development, which will continue. We're both committed to it. The coaching was something that PEG really put a lot of resources towards that we're both committed to maintaining, and alignment of EEC and DESE, because they speak different languages. One level of quality is good as 1, the other level of quality good as 4. Income and address and all those other things. So we continue to try and bring them together to see if we can get some alignment and get true blended classrooms.
Okay, thanks to you both. A lot to think about here. We certainly all can learn something from the Holyoke story. And even though you are a district in receivership, so you're in a little bit of a unique situation, I think some of these lessons are more broad that could be applied elsewhere. Rather than get into the specific Q&A right now, though, I want to transition to Springfield. So just so we have enough time for all the presentations, and then we will check in after that and answer some of the Q&A. Keep sending the questions through either the chat or the Q&A box. Thanks. So here we go with Springfield. Patrick Roach, take it away.
Hey everybody, glad to be here today. Little history on Springfield and the public schools. We've historically run our half-day integrated classrooms. They've all been kind of targeted at the SPED population. SPED student population is what drives the number and the number of classrooms. In 2015, we had about 883 students. We had the classrooms located in elementary schools across the city. We're in neighborhood elementary schools, but students were really assigned to their boundary schools. They were kind of put wherever the seats were or wherever they requested. And we historically had a lot of trouble filling our PM slots. It was something families just didn't want. So yeah, in the half-day model, you run a morning program and an afternoon program. The morning programs we would fill up, and the afternoon would always end up with quite a few vacancies for our peers. And it ran into some issues in actually servicing our SPED kids. That 883 students grew, so every single year we seem to be identifying more and more special ed kids, especially students with autism, and those numbers continued to climb. So in about 2015, we were up to 883 students. For years in Springfield, we've also ran a couple Montessori classrooms. Those were full day magnet, and we had about 224 students in 2015. Those numbers have been consistent. We've never really grown them or shrunk them. They've kind of stayed around that way. Families really loved the full day Montessori program. They were highly desirable, and we had wait lists at both schools that we had the program at. In Springfield, we also do a lot of collaborating with the private providers. We piloted a common curriculum so that everybody in the community was using the same curriculum in their programs. The Race to the Top grant, we did the Early Learning Challenge, partnering with all the private providers. We've done the professional learning communities across both classrooms, doing classroom visits, learning walks, trying to understand some of the best practices. In Springfield, we've had the CFCE grant, that's matching services for families needing early child care and other supports. And then in our vocational school, we have a pre-K classroom to teach our group of vocational kids how to become certified in pre-K. And Head Start manages the classroom for us, and in the past, Square One did as well. In 2015, we had a really unique opportunity in Springfield. A private preschool in the center of the city actually went out of business. There were some financial issues, and we were able to actually purchase the building. And in that building, we were able to do a very unique public-private partnership. We had public school pre-K classrooms. We had about 95 seats funded with Chapter 70 funds. We had some private classrooms. We had about 160 seats funded between EEC and PEG. We had private providers like YMCA, Square One, and Head Start running those pre-K rooms. And then there was also a wing in the building with infant toddlers, and Head Start got an early learning grant, and they had about 48 seats of the infant toddlers coming that way. We were a PEG community. PEG was an excellent grant for the city of Springfield. Little over 13 million over the 4 years. It funded the 195 seats. However, in Springfield, we had a lot of trouble filling those seats, believe it or not. The need was out there, but because of the requirements that you couldn't have previous pre-K experience, the previous experience was a challenge for us. So even though we had the seats and even though we had the need, we were under the grant, we were only able to fill about 80 to 85% of those seats. The families really wanted full day, but our requirements prohibited us from actually being able to fill them. That was a collaboration with YMCA, Head Start, and Square One. And with the PEG, we really tried to focus on quality, getting the bachelor level teachers, making sure we had high quality resources and materials. Lots of coaching similar to Holyoke, the coaching to try to get everybody on the same page, collaborative PD, wraparound and comprehensive services, and talking about the kindergarten transition. How do we get kids from pre-K into kindergarten and making sure everybody's ready for that kindergarten. We were also lucky enough to be part of the PEG planning grant that gave us a pretty good needs assessment of the community. One of the big things we discovered were neighborhood deserts. I think, even me personally, I had misconceptions on exactly what neighborhoods had lots of services and what neighborhoods didn't. And we found, Mason Square in the center of the city, where we thought the biggest need was actually oversaturated with preschool seats. And then we had some neighborhoods like Forest Park and 16 Acres and Indian Orchards where there weren't any program. Even the private providers were actually busing those kids from those neighborhoods into their programs in other neighborhoods. We also learned that only about 50% of the 3 and 4 year olds in Springfield were actually getting a pre-K experience. So when you think about that for a minute, you're like, oh, wow, only 50% of the kids in Springfield are actually getting that high quality pre-K experience. And the planning grant also allowed us to collaborate with a group beyond our core partners, but actually bring in other partners within the community and learn more about their program and us, gain a deeper understanding of the community in general. So going forward, in Springfield, I think we need to offer programs that meet student and family needs. That's the biggest thing we need to do going forward. So, Springfield Public Schools, our long-term goal would be full day pre-K for all 4-year-olds, serving them in their neighborhood schools. So not driving them across the city, not, hey, none of these deserts anymore, but how do we get programs in these neighborhood schools, and especially in schools where if they're going to be there for kindergarten and first grade, why don't we serve them in that preschool, in that school? Principals are a lot more supportive of it. Parents are a lot more supportive of it. We find attendance goes way up, and it's been pretty successful as we start to transition. We also want to make sure that we're offering the half-day integrated programs, the ones targeted to special ed kids for the 3-year-olds. And our goal with that is to do them in wherever we have sites available. And we have 2 early learning centers in Springfield as well in the public schools. So in FY18, we piloted a new model, full day pre-K. One of the reasons we never really did a lot of full day pre-K in the district is it was really expensive, and the money you get from Chapter 70 never supported funding those classrooms. So in order to fund full day, you have to cut other places in the budget. So in FY18, we kind of came up with a new model, and it was going full day and doing 20 students in a class. So rather than our normal, in the half day model, you do 15 a.m., 15 p.m., you're serving 30 kids. You go full day with that same model, and you're only serving 15 kids. So we were like, what if we went to this 20 student model? And that gets you pretty close to being a break-even point. You have to kick in a little other money. The Chapter 70 money didn't fully fund it, but we thought that model was a lot more fiscally sustainable. So in FY18, we piloted 2 classrooms, and they were very successful. In FY19, we added 5 more, and we started actually moving them out to the neighborhood schools. And as soon as we put those 5 classrooms out in the neighborhood schools, principals and parents and families and students, everybody was really excited about that. Because they didn't have to drive across the city, and they were in the same school as their brothers and sisters, and they were able to be there for kindergarten and first and second grade. This current year, we expanded again. We ended up adding 296 full day seats. We did a combination. We did some of those 20 student classes. They were actually mostly those 20 student classes. We also added a couple of the 15 student ones where there were kids with maybe some autism and some different special needs where we thought that model was better for them. And we also added some low incidence programs that only fit 7 kids, but we didn't want to discriminate against those kids. They need full day too. So we added a few low incidence classrooms as well. So where do we go from here? Next year and going forward, as of right now, our buildings are at capacity. We don't have any room to add more classrooms. And, that being said, our plan is at the end of the year, review the enrollment in our classrooms that are out there, take a look at some waitlist data. We had never actually taken waitlist data in the past, and we're starting to collect that this year. So we'll see if we have any classrooms. We'll see what did we fill and not fill, and do we have any parents that were looking for full day that only had half day available, and maybe we might convert some half days to full days, and we'll kind of make the decision based on what students and families really need. That's going to be our goal. That I mentioned the facilities being a challenge for us. The other big thing is the Chapter 70 funding. So with the new Chapter 70, this year's money, it's actually fully sustainable. It's you can fund a classroom using Chapter 70 funds this year. Whether it's the 20 students, you're 100% gonna get enough money to fund that class. If you're doing the 15 student class, you have to subsidize it a little bit, but it's very minimal. But the big problem is you don't get that money for another year. So have to actually come up with a year of seed funding. So we put money aside in Springfield in order to be able to do that seed funding. But I think a big thing in the state is if they had some grants that actually were offered to communities, it would make a big difference. If there was a grant to able to make up that Chapter 70 year one, then these programs would be sustainable because you'd be receiving Chapter 70 for these kids in the future years. I think the other thing in Springfield, probably the biggest piece of all of it is, how do we sit down and design public and private options that meet all of Springfield's student and family needs? How do we have lots of students that need the full day, that need the full year. Maybe they have special needs. And so, our community, we need to sit down and figure out, how do we meet kids and families' needs? What do families need? Where do they need it to be? What's the location? What are the hours? In the public schools, we're not full year. So how do we get these kids full year programs? Working with the private providers. CPPI gave us a chance to kind of have some of those conversations. We're looking at 2 public-private models. Our goal was to actually focus on quality and on fiscal sustainability. So we wanted to raise the quality of the options that we're providing for families. And then we didn't want, when CPPI goes away, these programs to go away. So we tried to focus on a couple models where when CPPI goes away, hopefully we can kind of continue the work. Anybody else who got a CPPI grant knows the challenge, right? What was being asked of our communities is, hey, we want you to do a PEG-like program, but then they didn't give us PEG-like money. So how do you build a PEG-like program without PEG-like money? 2 of the things we're trying in Springfield, the first model is extending the day for public school students. So we're partnering with YMCA, and they're going to be doing a little bit of before school and a little bit of after school programming coming into our public schools and trying to extend the day for our public school students. We have about 40 kids in 2 of our schools that we're piloting that with. The long-term goal for that is, if the CPPI goes away, the hope is that between vouchers, grants, or parent pay, public school money, we don't know yet. We're just trying to collect the data on how many of these kids have vouchers, how many don't, where can these funding sources come from, how much is it going to cost? Because our goal is, when CPPI goes away, we have the data to actually make the decision on being able to extend something like that.
Pat, do you mind if I ask one quick question?
Absolutely.
So we had a question come in about your length of day. So you've mentioned full day and half day a few times. Could you just define how long those are? Are they 6 hour, 8 hour, 6.5 hour?
So for our public schools, the half day is about 2.5 hours, and the full day mirrors your elementary school hours. Our goal is to mirror the elementary school hours. They actually get out an hour early compared to the elementary school hours, but the long-term goal is for them to mirror elementary school hours in our elementary schools. So model 2, Pushin Services. So with a couple of our providers that have classrooms, we had them put their special ed kids, focus them into a few of their classrooms. And then we're sending a couple of our Springfield Public Schools special ed teachers to actually do co-teaching and push-in services in those classrooms. So that way the students are getting they're in their private classrooms, they get to stay at their school. In the past, some of these kids are kids we might have put on a bus and bus them over to our program for the other half of the day, but rather than doing that, now they can actually stay in their private program. They don't have to get on a bus, they don't have to change schools, and we're sending teachers over to provide those special ed services, co-teach with the teachers, hopefully teach some of the private school providers some best practices related to special education and meeting our special ed students' needs. The long-term financial sustainability of that part is that we have been told by DESE that for the special ed kids, because we are providing them services, we will be able to claim them in our Chapter 70 numbers. And so if we do that and we receive the Chapter 70 money for them, that can go towards actually hiring the teachers and paying the teachers' salaries for the push-in services. So we believe that one's a very exciting model. It helps the private providers programs, helps the public schools, helps us with capacity as well. Rather than us taking all of the special ed kids, of which we're kind of at capacity for, we're actually able to serve them in their full day, full year classrooms. And we believe that we're hoping that one's gonna work really, really well. Both models get coaching and professional development as part of CPPI. So I think we need to figure out how do we sustain the coaching and CPPI in both of those models once CPPI funding actually goes away. The last slide I included, I won't spend a lot of time on, but just showing you the pre-K enrollment in Springfield. The first one shows you total pre-K enrollment, which is our half day, our Montessori, and our full day. Kind of shows you the seats in an FY20. Those are our funded seats. Our enrollment's not close to that point yet because we continue to get kids during the year as they age in. And then full day pre-K enrollment, you can see the the investment we've made in kind of going to full day, which is one of our goals. Is that's what our families are asking for, a full day. So that's what we're trying to get to. So we appreciate the time to share that.
Pat, one more quick question. Could you just say a bit more about the financial benefit to the private community-based partners when you were using the model you described, Model 2, which I believe is the push-in, collaborative approach to special education services?
So rather than them sending the kids over to the public schools, they get to keep the special ed kids in their classrooms. And so we're sending over the teaching services. And so we're sending over public school teachers to service their students and train their teachers, co-teach with their teachers. And the goal is going forward that it's not going to cost the private providers any money because we'll be able to fund it with public school dollars because we'll be claiming the kids in Chapter 70 and using the Chapter 70 money to fund the teachers' salaries. So we'll be able to provide the services at no cost to the private providers.
Great, thank you for that. That was one of the questions that had come through. So thank you for your presentation. A lot, again, to think about with Springfield, what could be adapted or brought to other communities. And just in the interest of time, we are going to keep rolling here and go to Boston next so that we can hear from the Boston story. There are a few questions still in the queue. We will try to get to them at the end. And if you have more questions, just add them to the Q&A box. But thank you, Pat. And now we're going to turn over to Jason Sachs and Tiara Diaz from Boston Public Schools.
Hi, this is Jason. I'm not sure if Tiara is on here because we're not in the same room. So Tiara, are you here? No. Okay, so then I'm just gonna do this myself. It looks like you want to leave room for questions. Did you just want me to go to 150 so that at least leaves you 10 minutes?
That would be perfect. Thanks.
Okay, no problem. Boston has been doing this for a while. And I guess unlike other communities, we have an investment from the city and the mayor, actually prior to the Preschool Expansion grant and prior to CPPI. The mayor had made a large investment in 2005. And so that was basically city funds to open it up in the public schools only. And we serve about 2,800 children, 4-year-olds for a 6-hour day. And that's only in the public schools. But we knew that community-based providers, that this was a hardship on them. And we also knew that families needed 12 months of the year, 8 to 10 hour a day. And so the idea was, could we build a public-private partnership? We call them community-based organizations. People are calling private providers, but when I say CBOs, that just means community-based providers. And so we got some private money basically to do a pilot called Boston Kids. Then the Preschool Expansion grant came, and then since then the CPPI, but most importantly, the mayor's office basically invested about $15 million for us to think about creating, to kind of complete universal preschools, of which we'd like to do about 750 seats in community-based organizations. And then we think about 700 more, though gentrification is certainly making us question whether or not we'll have enough 4-year-olds in the city. But the next kind of phase of expansion has been in community-based programs. We issued an RFP, and we've taken on about 470 children across, I believe, 27 classrooms in community-based programs. The elements of the RFP basically say you have to have a teacher's with a bachelor's degree. We're going to pay you the starting salary of a Boston public school teacher, which I believe is around $55,000. It's salary enhancements for directors. It's salary enhancements for assistant teachers. The commitment on their side, the community-based, is that they will be NAYC accredited, they will be QRIS level 3, and they will use our curriculum and receive our coaching. And there's more elements to it. And the other piece is there's a whole comprehensive service piece to this that we're funding, and we're thinking about actually separating out those funds for equity purposes, so that we're going to create a kind of a comprehensive service fund, so that if you have one program that has needs for children that are more intense, meaning they need more social workers, they need more special ed, whatever, we're going to start thinking about differentiating the funds for comprehensive services, but we're not there yet. The program thus far has been really informative, both for the public schools and community-based providers. One area that we're highly focused on is the implementation of the curriculum, and really thinking about, in community-based programs, for example, there is no common planning time. And so thinking about how teachers plan, what kind of supports directors need. Even though we're paying teachers $55,000, some programs have large turnover. And so really kind of think about stabilizing the workforce, what supports do directors need. And so we have pathway programs, and we have courses, the curriculum is now going to be online with college credit. And so we're really thinking about how do you support the workforce and how do you support directors. Since this is about financing, I'm going to tell you about kind of the pilot that we're doing with the state. So many of our providers had state subsidies. And so when we came and we said, hey, we're going to pay for this 6.5-hour day, 10 months of the year rate with BPS funds, which is about $11,000, just so you know. So we're basically saying, here's $11,000. The state said, well, we have a non-supplantation rule with our full day subsidies. So we're piloting with them. They're using a kindergarten rate now. And if they had a voucher, they're using a kindergarten extended rate. And the idea is that programs would then get a rate that basically covers the wraparound and the holidays and the summer services. And then we combine our rates with their rates. And then what we found was actually that cost programs an additional $1,500. So we then created an additional ask of our $15 million that we took out to cover the loss or the change of rate in there. So that was something we didn't anticipate, but that's something you should know, that if the school district or the city wanted to pay for this, we're supplanting, and you can't supplant, and so we're trying to figure this piece out. But that's also creating some interesting challenges because of wraparound services and parents paying for that, and then the parent fees don't necessarily match, or what they want to charge parents isn't necessarily what the state is allowing them to charge. And then we actually have some providers who are full day, full year saying we don't necessarily want to serve a child. It's not in our business model to serve for 6.5-hour a day. And so what are we going to do with that? So this is we're in the land of new territory. And it's been sort of a fascinating partnership. And I would say that the biggest thing has been the real partnership about what do we do what's best for families, what do we do what's best for kids, and then how do we really increase a focus on instruction. And the only other thing on focused instruction, I would say that math has taken extra professional development. It was easier to move literacy and strong vocabulary instruction, but moving teachers to a place where they're comfortable teaching math has taken additional professional development and work. So I'm sure I didn't touch on like 20 things. Oh, the only other thing I would say is I'm really interested in Springfield and Holyoke and your focus on students with disabilities. We are really thinking about special education programming and how UPK can be kind of a vehicle for us to really think through differently programming. And then the last thing I'm going to say is the other thing that this has really challenged us to think about is creating a real connector system so that if a child goes to a preschool program in a community-based setting, they should get a guaranteed seat in K2. Unfortunately, now in Boston, if you go to a BPS program, when you go to a BPS K1, you're guaranteed a seat in that school. In community-based, you're not guaranteed a seat. So parents sometimes have to leave the community-based program to go to a public school to guarantee a K through 8 experience or a K through 6 experience. So we're trying to figure out a universal enrollment system. All right, so it is 1:50, so I'll just answer questions.
Great, thanks, Jason. Lots of information here. Someone actually asked a question earlier about centralized enrollment, and it was in regards to Holyoke, but I'll let anyone answer it, I suppose, if it has relevance to you. The question is, curious about the enrollment process in Holyoke. The speakers mentioned a collaborative enrollment process to determine what type of slot is best for what child. Is there a specific set of criteria and process used to make those determinations? Is there a single point of entry enrollment system? So again, that question was for Holyoke, but Jason, if you have anything to share, feel free.
Yeah, that's a good question. We're working towards, I think, a more streamlined process for the entire city. We're not quite there yet, but for our collaborative effort with VOC, it is through our enrollment center. We have a centralized enrollment center that's pre-K to 12. So for the classes that the students that are ours and that are Holyoke Public Schools pre-K students, they do come through our office. For the CPPI classrooms, they often will come to us, and then my team, enrollment team, does know what options exist for them, and they will connect parents to VOC, and they've gotten better at trying to understand the profile of the student to see what would be the best fit for them. Clearly, if they're a special education student, they can't be served in the CPPI classrooms, but it depends on location of where the family lives, whether they need transportation or not, and because we don't offer transportation for pre-K students in general education, VOC does.
We do limited transportation.
They do more transportation. So, but we'd like to get to a more centralized enrollment process for all our, at least for 4-year-olds, as a goal moving forward.
Okay, any other comment that you would like to share, Jason or Pat, regarding that enrollment piece? I mean, you're trying to do things collaboratively with community partners. Are you making referrals across programs? How does it actually work when families show up and you can't necessarily assign them to a slot right away?
Yeah, so for us, this has been like a 3-part dance. They enroll into BPS, not to community-based. Community-based programs thus far find their own children, but then when they're short. So for example, BPS is about 95% filled. Right now, we're about 65% filled for community-based, and in part because kids are bouncing out of community-based programming because we don't have this formal connector yet. But our goal now is we go to the BPS wait list. We have a common place where people can call in, like on our website. And then we are also calling families and doing that work as we speak. So that's sort of what we're trying to do. But once we build this formal connector, we think we'll have resolved it.
In Springfield, when we got the PEG grant, we did a lot of centralized advertising and enrollment. We coordinated between the public schools and the private providers, and we really focused on centrally when families were coming in, signing them up for the PEGS program, the full day, full year program. Since that time, we've been working really hard to build this portal where families would come in doing the central enrollment like they would to sign up for the public schools, but we would be able to refer them to the private providers. So, you know, it's in a pilot stage. We haven't been able to get it off the ground, but our hope is that that'll become a really useful tool for our community. The third thing that's kind of coming up right now with CPPI is now in that model 2 where we're leaving the special ed kids in the private providers' classrooms. We had a meeting a few weeks ago, and some of our private providers were having trouble recruiting enough special ed kids. And we just so happen to have a wait list of special ed kids that we're trying to put into classrooms. So I think as we're calling these families, if we're not able to find them classrooms in the district, or they want the full year, or they want it in a different neighborhood, they're looking for something, we're absolutely planning to refer the special ed kids over to these providers that have some extra seats. And I think that's a win-win for everybody.
Great. Thanks to everyone for sharing your thoughts on the coordinated enrollment. I know that's one of the hot topics folks are thinking about when they're implementing CPPI. One question we had earlier in the webinar was about the blending of funding. So do you all see blending of Chapter 70 and EEC subsidy dollars as a reasonable solution or a possibility for other communities? Or do you think it's likely just to take place in Holyoke due to the status of receivership?
No, in Holyoke, what receivership allowed us to do is to bring an operator in pretty easily in terms of contracting with an outside entity to run our pre-K, at least one pre-K program. The blending I don't think is unique to a receivership. I think it's just about the willingness of both departments to talk about how you can strategically use that funding. And Pat I know this is certainly Pat's background, but you know, I see that the school day is a short day. You know, it's a typical school day, but parents need more than that. They need full day, which extends at least 5, 6 o'clock. And then they also need full year, which extends throughout the summer. So if I believe there should be a way to pair sort of the funding that's intended just for your traditional school day with the funding, with additional funding that's about full wraparound care. And it would, you know, be much easier for parents if that was at their home school, you know, to have, so the kids don't need to be bused to another location and that they could stay there year round. Typically in the child's neighborhood, I think that would be much more convenient and a better situation for families. But I don't think that's just about receivership.
And we aren't able to blend it in the way we would like to. Ideally, we could, you know, make the case that the public school pays for this many hours per day. So Chapter 70 covers this many hours. EEC would cover the balance before and after. But then you're talking about you're taking the income restrictions, you're taking all these other qualifications EEC has, and then the address too. So you're eligible for EEC if you live in a different community, if you work near a school and want to go there. That isn't the case with the public schools. So how can we reconcile all these things that don't seem like they're huge mountains to move, but we just have to get everybody speaking the same language?
Great.
In Springfield, that's our absolute goal. I mean, that in my mind, that is the solution for public and private providers, and most importantly, the kids, to extend the day and extend the year and get everybody involved. And you know, personally, I've actively tried to do as much as I can, and there's so much red tape that it's the biggest challenge. You know, and hopefully we can, as a state, figure out how to overcome it.
Great, thank you. And there were about 4 more questions. We're not going to have time for them all, but we will follow up with folks offline. One question that is important that hasn't been raised yet is regarding staffing. So the question is, how does a community-based organization with multiple classrooms deal with one classroom staff being paid at a higher salary than other classrooms not funded? I think in the case of CPPI or the BPS model, this has come up. So we're not going to get into it right now, but we will get some answers from the panelists and share them.
So before Titus closes, I just want to say that, you know, we have been thinking about this for a long time, and we see this really as the first step of a conversation. We know everyone got a ton of information. We're so grateful to the speakers and panelists who shared their story so eloquently and so honestly. And we know that this has probably raised a lot of questions. We kind of intentionally wanted to keep it as an overview and then want to think about ways to keep digging in this. Titus will share some thoughts about next steps, but I just don't want people to feel frustrated that we only had an hour, because I think we've been hearing these stories and we wanted to kind of set some context for people who are interested in continuing these conversations.
Exactly. Thanks, Amy. So this is hopefully an ongoing conversation, and we can share a follow-up email with what we can share by the end of the week, and then we can make connections across communities so that you could have more in-depth conversation with some of the panelists if you're interested. So very quickly, some easy next steps. Please find out if your school district plans to expand preschool with new state education funding. Several panelists mentioned this. In the FY19 state budget, there was a pretty large increase in Chapter 70 state aid for public education. The Student Opportunity Act, which is pending, it actually will be discussed in the conference committee tomorrow. The House and Senate have both passed versions of this. It would result in roughly $1.5 billion in increased education funds over the next 7 years. There is a clause in this bill that allows districts to, or encourages districts to spend funding on early education and pre-K within the district, including those provided in partnership with community-based organizations. So we are closely monitoring, you know, how districts and the state interpret that, and if anyone sees that as an opportunity to do more in this area. I also think that CFOs, chief financial officers, are great resources, and Pat is the CFO and operations director for Springfield. So, you know, these are the folks in your community that actually manage the budgets and are thinking about blending and braiding maybe at a different level from a typical advocate or champion for early ed. So definitely connect with them in your local community. The CPPI program, Strategies for Children, will continue to advocate for this in the FY21 state budget. As many of you know, the budget this year included $5 million. Our initial ask was $25. We think that there really is a lot of demand across the state. So please, if you're connecting with folks around advocacy, please raise the importance of that line item. An increase would allow to expand within the 9 current grantees, but also reach new communities as well. Thinking back to that map we showed earlier, there are 19 communities that have plans, and that's really just the start of what could be a broader expansion. So yeah, keep planning, keep collaborating, keep up the great work, raise awareness where you can, and thank you to the panelists, but thank you, of course, to everyone on the call as well for all the great work that you are leading in your community. And with that, we'll close the webinar, and as I mentioned, we'll send out a recording link and the slides and some additional follow-up info, hopefully by the end of this week. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.